Hello and welcome. My name is Adam Lefevre Hughes. I'm the education coordinator for the Association of Lutheran Church Musicians. And I am here today with Lorraine Brew, past president of ALCM and member of ALCM, I guess, probably for a while. We're working on, we've been working through talking about the winners of the Raabe Prize. That is the Raabe Prize for Excellence in Sacred Music Composition. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about Richard Proulx's piece, which was the 2001 prize-winning piece, um, "We Adore You, O Christ." I've been listening to this piece the last couple of weeks, and it's so interesting and it's so beautiful. So Lorraine, I asked you here because I thought we could talk a little bit about it. Unfortunately, Richard has joined the church triumphant. Not unfortunately, but I guess that we are unable to speak with him. But I thought that maybe you and I could talk a little bit about his piece. But first, maybe you can tell us a little bit about Richard Proulx. Um, I had to I had to remind myself, and I thought it would be interesting for us to learn more about him.
Yes, he is a person that I admired very much in my professional life, although I never met him. He was born in 1937 and died in 2010. And his life, I think, it's sort of convenient to think of his life in two halves. The first half was in Minneapolis, St. Paul. That's where he was educated. That's where he served his first Roman Catholic parish. He also received a degree in organ performance from the University of Minnesota. So I think that tells us a little bit about his background. He was a Roman Catholic his entire life, I believe, although he did lots of ecumenical work. And the turning point in his life, the second half was uh, he was he became the musician at Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago, and that gave him a platform for both bringing renowned music to the Chicago area, but also he formed this group that became pretty famous called the Cathedral Singers, and
Mm.
he assembled this group solely, I believe, for the purpose of recording choral music. And I don't think it was just his own, but he had a vision for this group to do recordings, and they made something like 30 recordings, 30 CDs or
Wow.
so. So it was
Wow.
it was a big project, and some of its music got picked up, for instance, by TV shows as well known as ER. Some of
Huh?
the background music in ER, but others too. And I don't know that that was his purpose. But this Cathedral Singers group became a way for people to be acquainted with high level Roman Catholic choral music. And I think that was its main function, its main purpose. And it's how many of us got to know his music. So he was an organist, he was a composer, he was a choral conductor, but he was also very interested in work in hymnals. He worked on several hymnals outside of Roman Catholic circles. And I think just looking at what's in ELW of his gives a really good view of his variety of interests. For instance, the two settings I think that we have of Schubert's Deutsche Messe in ELW in the service music section are arrangements that he did. And then a piece of his most famous mass setting called the community mass is represented with the Sanctus. The Sanctus of the community mass is in ELW. And that mass I have used at Valpo, and it full bodied, it's organ, brass, congregation. I think that's probably it. And it's a wonderful setting that,
Mm.
like all of his liturgical music, isn't overly difficult, but has a freshness and unique spirit about it. And then his last contribution in ELW, I believe, is the tune Castlewood. And Castlewood is the tune that we use in ELW to come to us, creative spirit.
Oh, oh,
So I
okay.
think that shows, a side of him that is maybe we even pass by and don't even realize, because he was also this really important composer. But no liturgical minutia was too small for him to consider, or to work with somebody's other music like Schubert's and make it liturgically useful. So I think we see there a deep, deep interest in liturgical music and how it serves the congregation.
Yeah.
One other influence I'd like to mention, so I don't forget it, is that probably through his Minneapolis St. Paul life, he got to know and admire Paul Mons. And this information I pulled up from a dissertation by Christopher Ganza, who did his entire dissertation, doctoral dissertation, on the work of Proulx. And he mentioned that Proulx admired Mons both for his improvisational ability, but also for his ability to write suitable music for amateur choirs. And I think those two things were things that Proulx valued and developed himself, but credits Paul for putting him onto that. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. Well, as you said, so many he had his hands in so many different aspects of church music. And so
Yes.
let's kind of unpack some of that, because I think there's kind of a lot to talk about there. I think it makes sense to start out just a little bit about the piece itself. We adore you, O Christ. What can what can you tell us about it, or maybe sort of walk us through some of the maybe the compositional traits, or some of the choices that Richard made, or when might we use this? I have a couple ideas, but I think it might be useful for us to start there.
Sure. Well, first to note that it's a rather short piece. It's 43 measures, I believe. And so again, he's writing in a sort of a compact form here so that it can be useful in a liturgical service. Um, but he's using a text, he notes, from the Good Friday Orthodox service. It was an approved text in Roman Catholic circles, but it came from the Orthodox. So again, he's reaching out, I don't know if you want to say ecumenically, but he's reaching out toward Orthodox um, communication in taking this text. And it's built, it's built on a scale, a synthetic scale that he developed. It's not a Gregorian scale. It recalls the tone of it recalls a Byzantine scale, but it's not a Byzantine scale. It's a major scale with a raised fourth and a lowered seventh. And that isn't any other scale. But what it evokes right in the beginning is that this is a non-Western musical setting. And so we don't know, as the listener, that, if it's modal or if it's Byzantine or what it is. And in fact, it's its own thing. But he creates this non-Western idea through the use of that scale, as well as through a drone that he begins in the very beginning of the piece with the bass and the tenors
Right.
at um, at a fifth, open fifth, which then it immediately recalls the idea of chant and organum and early chants. So we hear that from the very beginning. And then the sopranos and altos enter with the text. And, the first three notes are a major scale, and then there's a raised fourth. And
Mhm.
so within the first three measures, you know that something non-Western is going on.
Right.
Uh, and
Yeah.
he continues that way. There's a drone in the piece in every measure of the piece. And for quite a while, it's the tenor and the basses that hold this open fifth. But before the middle of the piece, the drone changes to just a single note in the altos, and then the three parts around it are singing in unison around this drone. So there's nothing that a person would not be able to figure out by looking at the score. It's sitting right there, but it's going to sound, to most of our ears, pretty unusual. And then to make it just a little more unusual, when he gets to into the piece a little bit, he adds grace notes here and there. And
Mhm.
that then also gives this non-Western, almost Indian idea of these grace notes that move to the center note over this drone and over this synthetic scale.
Right.
So he uses all of these techniques that any choir could figure out. You don't have to know anything about any of these musics to do it, but you're going to end up singing in this style that is very non-Western. I assume he did that all on purpose to create a sense of perhaps mystery
Mhm.
around this idea of "We adore you, O Christ."
Sure.
And you had mentioned the use of the piece, which is most obvious for Good Friday. I'd be interested if you see some other uses for it as well, but that's basically where I would see it, perhaps at the adoration of the cross, or as an introduction to the service, something like that.
Yeah. Well, and that sort of that ancient quality that he evokes just from the beginning with the drones and the synthetic scale, right? As I've been listening to it, it transports you to this almost otherworldly place where,
Mhm.
you're in Richard Proulx's world now,
Exactly.
and it's just so fascinating and yet beautiful. He manages to do that, but without alienating the listener, I think.
And it remains simple.
Right.
It sounds very, if you were listening to it and not having the music in front of you, I think we would think it's pretty difficult. But the way he writes it, you're using things that you know how to do, but he uses them in a way that, although they're simple, they end up sounding very non-Western. And I
Right.
think that's part of his genius, that he was trying to write for an amateur parish choir.
Yeah. Well, and that's something I think we can all use those pieces where where it's accessible and yet just it has that quality of sounding like it's so much more than it is.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know,
Yeah, I think
I,
that's right. Uh-huh.
as a as a keyboardist, I always loved finding those pieces that sounded really impressive when you play them, but in actuality aren't too difficult.
Well, I think
And
this would fit.
yeah, and I think that we like having those, and so thank you, Richard. Yeah.
Indeed.
You had mentioned earlier that uh, Prue had worked on a number of hymnals and resources. Um, And I was looking, I had found that too, and I had been looking up some of those, and it seemed that some of those came out shortly after Vatican II. Um, and it just, with his association with the Holy Name Cathedral in Chicago and all of that, I'm sure all of these things were swirling around. And what um, how does that play out? Do we see that uh, evidence of that in this piece, or what do we see there?
Yeah, I think, again, I'll refer to Christopher Ganz's work because I didn't know this about Prue, and I didn't know um, about his responses to Vatican II.
Mm.
Obviously, when the reforms came about, he was in his early 30s, I guess, or around 30. And yes, what Christopher Ganza notes is that Vatican II suggested that music needed to be written for choirs of varying abilities, and that the music also needed to be well suited to small choirs. So the documents, the conciliar documents, mention that. Well, what in 99% of cases, right after the mid 60s, composers took up writing folk music and introducing guitars into the Roman masses. And this was wildly popular. And a lot of fine musicians wrote music in that genre, and that became pretty much the dominant genre in the late 60s and 70s. What Proulx attempted to do, according to Ganza, is to take those words from Sacrosanctum Concilium and use those words in a very different musical direction. So the directions from the document say the ability to write for choirs of varying abilities and to write music that is well suited to small choirs with high artistic integrity.
Mm.
So he used those same words that all those folk composers did, and he attempted to do something completely different.
Yeah,
So I think We Adore You, O Christ is a good example of that. It's
sure.
simple. It could be sung by a quartet or an octet, certainly
Mm.
small choir. It's very accessible, as we mentioned, that it sounds more difficult than it is. And he was taking those cues right from the Vatican documents.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And thinking, about our current time, right, in 2024, where many choirs are perhaps smaller than they were a few years ago, and it's interesting to hear and consider that that's a been a consideration for a long time, right? That we're
Mhm.
trying to make sure that things are of high quality, that we're writing good quality music, but that is also um, doable by many different
Mhm.
groups of people and sizes of groups.
Yeah, it
That's
might be a reason to look again at more of his choral music. Lutherans tend to know a few of his most favorite things and his liturgical music, but there may be a lot more there
yeah,
that now, as you say, with smaller resources, might be, very important, very
yeah,
possible.
yeah. Well, that's a good commendation for us, I think, to
Mm-hmm.
to look that
Mm-hmm.
up. Um, so, thinking about some of that and connecting, drawing that line, I guess, between, these two times, and that how, we're the church is always in need of those pieces that are accessible and yet also of high quality. Um, we're always trying to encourage people to keep writing for music for the church. And so, what might we learn, or what might composers today take from Proux's work, either this piece or any others maybe that are familiar to you, or
Mm-hmm.
what can we gain from that, or what can our composers perhaps glean and then put to work in their own compositional process?
I think maybe one of his hallmarks is that his music is simple, but not simplistic.
Mm.
And so, a lot of the music that goes by publishers' desks is simple, but what you see is what there is, and there isn't anything else.
Mhm.
And yet, as you've mentioned too, the further you go into a Proulx piece, and I think this is true of the liturgical music as well. I think the community mass again would be really worth congregations, even with small resources, considering using more. That it's simple music in that it's not difficult to sing, but it's not simplistic. It's fresh, it's unique. It doesn't sound like anything else. It you don't I don't think you hear a Proulx anything and say, "Oh yeah, I've heard hymns just like that before."
Right.
I think of Come to Us Creative Spirit
Mhm.
and how that's a perfect text, I think, to use with this tune. I don't know what text he had in mind for that tune, but that tune, um, is a bit unpredictable without ever being difficult, without ever having difficult leaps in it, and yet it's still a fresh tune. And so I guess I would hope that composers would find those things that don't have to be complicated in order to be profound.
Yeah, yeah, finding that balance between almost just complicated enough or
Hmm.
but I really appreciate that distinction, that simple but not simplistic.
Yeah.
That's a really important idea, I think,
Uh-huh.
and a wonderful way to summarize it.
Uh-huh. And to think for Prue, that goes all the way back to the Vatican II documents.
Right.
And that there are still things that all of us can learn about, what the 1960s were about for Roman Catholics and how we can still benefit from what they did. And I think he can help us sort it out just a bit. Because I think, most of us Protestant musicians initially thought this was all just going folk music. And obviously we picked up a lot of it, but I'm not sure we understood that there were some deeper threads here that could still benefit us.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, this has been such an interesting conversation. Is there anything else that maybe we haven't touched on, or is there something else that we should talk about or should know?
Let me just go back for just a second to the piece, to the We Adore You, O Christ. And again, this is Christopher Gansa that pointed this out, but that the text is a combination. The first two lines are attributed to St. Francis, and the last two are attributed to the Roman Missal, and that the combination of those lines is more than just a sorrowful text, but that it does point toward the resurrection.
Mm,
And I certainly overlooked that when I first did this piece. As I told you, I think I did it a couple of times
yeah,
with the Cantorai on Good Friday.
right,
But I think Gansa is correct that while it is a profound Roman Catholic Roman Missal text, it does also point to the mystery of both the Passion and the Resurrection. And I
right.
think that makes it even a stronger case for its use.
Yeah, yes, and I think as we approach, we're recording this as we approach Holy Week, and thinking about those that paradox, and um, you're always trying to manage both sides of that coin. Um, of yes, especially on Good Friday, right? It
Right.
it is, it is a really I don't know, dramatic story, for lack
Mhm.
of a better word. And yet, we call it good. And I
Mhm.
think that so often we find ourselves leaning a bit more into the sadness of the day,
Mhm.
when there's also the good to share. And so,
Always. Right.
yeah, right.
Mhm.
And that is the event by which salvation is gained.
Right.
Well, coupled with resurrection, of course.
Correct.
Um, yeah, yeah. So really, really interesting. Before we stop, but first, thank you, Lorraine, so much for your time and this
You're welcome.
conversation. If you would like to learn more about Richard Proulx, I discovered that there's an interview with over on Concordia University Center for Church Music's website, um, where Mike Silhavy and Bob Battistini are talking about Richard Proulx, and it's really kind of an interesting interview, and they talk about some of his legacy and some of
Mm.
what he brought to that. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, oh gosh, I'd love to learn more, we'll make sure to put that link um, in the video and also in the description. But Lorraine, thank you so much for taking the time and energy to help walk us through this important piece of music, and to help perhaps introduce another generation to Richard Proux's work, because I think that As we sort of mentioned, we have some of those resources in our hymnals, but maybe there's more yet to discover. And
Mhm.
so, thank you
I-
so much.
You're welcome. I would think so too. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks. Yep.